I'm here to talk about book history and Joachim Meyer. I, we have not met before, am the director of Wichtenauer, and I also run a company called HEMA Bookshelf. I've been doing HEMA since 2001, and Wichtenauer since 2010-ish. And much more recently, I've gotten really interested in the study of books as physical objects, and especially copies of Joachim Meyer. And I'll talk about more of that a little bit more as we go through. But what we're going to talk about today, a little bit about Joachim Meyer. How many of you were at Liam's lecture earlier? Couple? Good. He had a lot more to say about Joachim Meyer, I'm sure, even though I missed it, but I've seen it before. Then we're going to talk about the book. We're going to talk about the Meyer census, and then talk about what I'm calling user interactions, and I'll explain what that means. And then, if we have time at the end of the hour, we'll go through some funny quotes about Joachim Meyer from other fencing masters. And either way, we will wrap up. Hopefully by 3, which I think is when they throw me out of here. So, Joachim Meyer probably didn't actually look like this. Here's a picture from Joachim Meyer's book, though, of a guy with kind of a messed up brow ridge who appears a bunch of times in his book. And I like to think that's Joachim Meyer, but who knows really. But he was born in Basel in 1537. He traveled widely when he was a young man, probably as part of his membership in the craft guilds. He settled in Strasbourg in 1560, at which time he married a widow, and that gave him fast-track access to becoming a full member of the Cutlers Guild. And he died in 1571, in February, probably. Although the documentation on that is not as firm as we might like. In that 10-year period from him arriving in Strasbourg and dying in Mecklenburg, he did quite a lot of fencing. He organized several Fechtschule, where his students were publicly tested for various fencing ranks. And his students also went on to organize lots and lots of fencing events, especially Liam's favorite student of his, Weigand Brack, who organized like 100. We think of him primarily as, in terms of a book that we call the 1570, and we call it that because it was published in 1570. But before that, he wrote at least 2 other manuscripts. One of them is we call the Lund manuscript because it's currently in Lund in Sweden. It was written for Otto von Solms, who was a teenage student of Joachim Meyer's. He was probably 12 or 13 when Meyer taught him. It has this cool picture at the beginning, but what it mostly covers is the two-handed sword, the dusak, and rapier. And it has some of these weird little cutting diagrams like this in the back as well. We've known about this manuscript for quite a while. It's been published in translation by my friend Jeffrey Forgang. Another manuscript which only came out to our awareness a few years ago when Olivier Dupuis rediscovered it. It's currently in the National Museum in Munich. And this is written for another teenage student of Joachim Meyer, Jerry Hans von Veldens. And this one actually covers not just the sword, the dusak and rapier, but also dagger, and it covers polearms, and it is the only thing Meyer ever wrote that we know of that covers armored fencing. So this gives us pretty much every weapon that Meyer teaches, all in one nice package, with very brightly colored illustrations. And there's also a third manuscript which exists in Rostock in Germany, which he owned and might have been his own reference book because it was mostly older writings on fencing from the 15th and early 16th centuries. But it does have a few things that Meyer himself added, mostly about rapier fencing, which he says he learned from a dude named Stefan Heinrich von Eberstein. And this one he had in his possession when he died, which was in 1571. Like I mentioned, he had received a contract to teach yet more teenage nobles because and this is the thing that I think people often don't quite process, is that adults, especially adult nobility, didn't need fencing teachers. They already knew how to fence. So when you got a sweet gig teaching a noble how to fence, it was usually, between a 12 or 13-year-old kid whose parents hired you because they wanted to finish his education with fencing. By the time they were adults, they were not in need of a fencing teacher. So when he gets hired by the Duke of Mecklenburg, he was not hired because the Duke of Mecklenburg was personally interested. He was hired because he had a 13-year-old kid and a 10-year-old kid who was going to need instruction in a few years. And when Meyer was traveling out to take on this new assignment in 1571, he got sick and died. Very sad, at the age of 33. And that's about all we're going to say about his life. Like I said, corner Liam. Liam knows way more about Joachim Meyer's life than I do, because that's what he's been obsessed with for a couple of years now. The question that a lot of people have when we start talking about this, though, is why the hell was Meyer making manuscripts? This is the 1560s. This is 100 years after the invention of movable type by Gutenberg. Actually in Strasbourg, funny enough, but in the 1450s. So 100 years later, why was Meyer not just having all of his books printed? And the answer is that printing books is actually a lot of work. And in the era before typewriters, you could not actually create a printed book without first making a manuscript, because the words had to come from somewhere. And when the printer was doing the printing, he needed to have a handwritten book that he was printing. So manuscripts did not go away with the advent of movable type. And here I just have a picture from the Lund manuscript, and then a very similar one from the 1570 printed book. The process of printing was actually quite complicated. It involved a lot of people with different jobs, which I'm going to blaze through really quick here, because you needed to hire a scribe if you weren't actually good enough at handwriting yourself to create a book. And you would either dictate to him, or you would give him stuff that was already written down to recopy into a single book. You would also need to hire an artist to draw the illustrations by hand. This is a print from Joost Amann, who did this amazing book that's just pictures of people with jobs, which is usually called the Book of Trades, and shows tons of different craftsmen and skilled people doing their work. And there's an artist. This is not a picture of a scribe, so I couldn't find, he didn't have a scribe in his book. This is, I think, St. Peter. But he's doing the things that scribes would do, so close enough. I think that's by Lucas Krennic. And when we look at Meyer's book, we discover that the art that he used in his manuscripts actually gets recycled very often into the printed book that he would produce in 1570. So both of these manuscripts, even though they're much shorter than his eventual book, in some ways were like preparatory works. He probably wasn't planning to write a huge book, but he used everything he'd created for those manuscripts when he did get around to creating this book. And since I didn't actually explain very well, you've got these two big ones are from the Lund manuscript, and the small ones in the background are all from the Munich manuscript, which when you combine them together, they turn into a print like this. And this is what the art in Joachim Meyer's book in 1570 actually ended up looking like. After you get the art drawn by artists, then you take it to an engraver, or a Formschneider in German, who would create actual printing blocks to create the art. And in this case, there are 62 of those giant prints, which are often attributed to Tobias Stimmer, but they're probably created by his brother, Hans Christoph Stimmer. Their artwork is so similar that even art historians can't really tell them apart. And Tobias never actually put his monogram in the book anywhere, whereas Hans Christoph Stimmer has his monograph bright and clear on the first page. So the less famous Stimmer brother. And the very distinctive style of artwork here is called mannerism. This is another Joost Amann. And Joost Amann and Tobias Stimmer are two of the most famous mannerist artists. There's not going to be a quiz on this, but anyways, if you ever wondered what this really interesting and distinctive style that you see in pictures like Joachim Meyer stuff is. That's mannerism. So, after you get the art done and you have the book handwritten, then you have to go and take it to a printer, which in this case was Thibault Berger, who was sort of a shady fly-by-night printer. He was not guild sanctioned for the first few years that he operated, so he was doing secret printing, and he mostly specialized in sort of political, religious tracts, so cheap, like things people would hand out in the street. So Meyer might have been his first major printing work. He was trying to go legit and turn into a real printer, and he eventually became a properly certified guild printer. But in 1570, he was still making the jump. And Meyer might have gone to him because he was cheap. We don't really know. The book itself is 9 by 7 inches, roughly, or 23 by 18 centimeters, and I meant to bring a visual aid. And I'm going to message someone right now and see if they can run it over to me instead of abandoning you. Because I have a replica of the book that I was